Hello, and welcome to this Beyond Clean virtual conference. The speakers for today's conference, the sponsors for today's conference, and the Beyond Clean team are all so excited that you're here. If this is your first time joining us for a Beyond Clean virtual event, I want to call your attention to a couple of event functions. All of the windows on your event screen are movable. You can shrink them, you can enlarge them, you can move them, whatever you need to do to create the event feel that works best for you. In the upper right corner is a resources tool. Download conference sponsor information and the resources and links that your speakers have provided for you, as well as instructions for obtaining your CE certificate for the day's event. On the bottom left, you will see a Q&A or question and answer tool. Any questions that you have for the speaker during each session can be submitted to them using this feature. Our speakers today will bring you a wealth of knowledge, and all of their information can be found in the speaker bio tool on the right side of your screen. Along the bottom are the icons for each of the windows as well. Clicking these will minimize and maximize each window. This will be an action-packed conference, and there will be 15-minute breaks between each of the sessions. So feel free to grab a snack, check on the dogs or the kids, assemble a tray, do some jumping jacks, whatever you need to do before joining us again. All right. Good morning from Minneapolis, Minnesota, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled that you are here. My name is Lindsay Brown, and I am here from the Beyond Clean team. And you all are tuned in to the industry's first conference focused exclusively on safety topics in sterile processing departments. Today's speakers will be providing you the critical information that you need to ensure your teams and your departments are taken care of, from the moment you clock in to the time that you walk out of the doors after a hard day's work. It's Saturday, everybody. I understand that you probably have a lot going on, juggling so many things at home and at work. And I just want to say thank you for being here, for being dedicated to education, for doing something that will help you grow as a healthcare professional. If you need to step away from the live sessions at any time throughout the day, not to worry, all 7 sessions will be available on demand. So sit back and relax, and we're going to get ready for an incredible day of learning. As we set up this first conversation, Andy Petrovich and Hank Balch are going to be talking about instructions for use and the dirty secrets of IFU noncompliance and how your department can save the world. And before we get started, I would like to lead everyone through a couple of quick poll questions. I would love to get your feedback on these poll questions. So on your screen, you'll see that first poll question. It says, what percentage of instruments are you certain that you followed the instructions for use? And you can actually scroll on that screen and select which option makes the most sense for you. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. So what percentage of instruments are you certain that you followed the instructions for use? Is it 100%, 75 to 99%, 50 to 74, 25 to 49? Not a huge percentage, or honestly, you don't really know. All right, so let's see what you all submitted. Okay, what percentage of instruments are you certain that you followed the IFU? 100%? 75, okay, so a good percentage of you follow the IFU, or you're sure you follow the IFU most of the time. Okay, so that is actually going to tee up our discussion today. And the title of this presentation is called Let's Be Honest. And I loved that we used this particular poll question to kind of tee this conversation up. I'm going to take it a little bit further. And I know it's Saturday. For a lot of us, it's in the morning. So this next question is a little loaded, but I'd love for you to take the time. What would it take for your department to be compliant with instructions for use? And you can choose all of the options that apply. And there are quite a few of them because IFU compliance is a very big topic. So take your time, scroll through, and select all that apply. The options are real-time IFU guidance, calculated built-in timers for each step of decontam, detailed communication for each step of decontam, warnings and alerts that help prevent damage and costly replacements, tray-level training videos that show you how to follow the IFU, instant access to instrument identification for training purposes, automatic compliance documentation that provides or that proves that the IFU was followed, fully digitized and immediate access to IFUs right at the sink, and documented proof that a tray was cleaned, decontaminated, and sterilized based on the IFUs. All right, so once you hit submit, let's see what everyone had to say. Okay, interesting. All right, so the most popular answer was the warnings and alerts that help prevent damage and costly replacements. But all of them had a great mix of selections. So thank you everyone who participated in that. I am so excited to introduce the speakers for today. Andy Petrovich is the co-founder and president and CEO of Petrovich Incorporated, the leader in sterilization intelligence software for surgical instrument IFUs. Andy has more than 2 decades of expertise and knowledge in sterile processing and is a thought leader and strategist who has helped so many hospital departments strengthen their processes and programs across clinical operations. Hank Balch is the co-presenter for this presentation. He's the founder and president of Beyond Clean. He's an industry writer, blogger, social media connoisseur. He's written over 150 sterile processing articles, and his work is published across the globe. Andy and Hank will talk about technology solutions that could vastly improve compliance within the industry and regulatory mandates, such as digitized IFUs, step-by-step instructions, built-in timers, things like that. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you on this Saturday morning to Andy Petrovich and Hank Balch.
Hey, good morning, Sterile Processing Universe. My name is Hank Balch, and I'm here with Andy Petrovich. We're going to be talking about IFUs and non-compliance in sterile processing. The title of this presentation, as you can see, is Let's Be Honest. So hopefully there's going to be a lot of honesty, not just from us, but hopefully from you today. And as we click through this first slide, as you see, is going to be discussing the idea of giving ourselves permission to be honest. And what we mean by that is, in our industry, there is a lot of pressure from internal places like administrators, from managers, maybe from your coworkers, but also external pressures from accreditation organizations, outside state health departments, to be 100% compliant with IFUs. Now that pressure is good, right? So we are going to be talking about compliance this entire presentation. However, the pressure can drive us sometimes to be not quite 100% honest with how we're doing in that compliance. And I'll give you a great example. The last thing that a sterile processing manager or technician wants to do is give the impression to your boss or your administrators that you're not following your IFUs, right? The assumption is from our leaders that we've got everything under control in sterile processing, nothing to see here, we're good to go. So there can be a lot of confusion from administrators, but there can be a lot of lack of transparency in our industry behind what's really going on in our departments on the front line from a day-to-day basis as it relates to IFU compliance. So this presentation is not about blame. It's not about a gotcha or trying to pull back the curtain to get anyone in trouble. However, if we don't admit as technicians and leaders of these departments that we still have problems and we have systemic problems in following IFUs, if we don't admit those things, we cannot and we will not find solutions. So as we kick this presentation off, I want to urge you and I want to give you permission to be honest with yourself and to be honest with your industry on the challenges around IFU compliance.
And thank you so much. This is such an exciting subject. I think we've all been escaping it for years and years. And unfortunately, that's just the way the industry has kind of fallen into place. We always talk about us being the heart of the hospital. And really, I know our desires. We always really, truly want to do what's right for the patient. And we do want to work together. And in order to make this a positive change for our industry, these are just subjects that have to come to surface and that we have to continue to navigate through to make this industry better for not only us as sterile processing professionals, but the outcome for the patient. We cannot and we should not settle for less. If we look at this as sterile processing professionals, we're at risk every day, and we're actually responsible for these patients and, of course, the outcomes that come from it. And again, having this opportunity to talk about this subject is critical for us to move forward. And I'm excited to go ahead and continue on with this dialogue. Thank you.
Well, speaking of outcomes, as you see on this next slide, there are headlines all over the place in the United States, but actually across the globe for breakdowns as it relates to the reprocessing of medical devices. We've seen it here over the last couple of years in places. I won't name the hospitals, but you can see some of the hospital names on the slide here. And, you know, I want you to realize as a technician, if this hasn't happened to your hospital, it could. And the reality and the honesty, again, as we mentioned before, is that there are things probably happening today in your hospital or have happened over the last year that if the media were to find out about it, it could have become a national headline. Just because you haven't hit the news yet is not proof or confirmation that what you or your team is doing is actually compliant with all of the instructions for use for your devices. These are just a couple of headlines that give that example. Here I want to take a couple of minutes and actually show you a news clip that's discussing a sterilization breakdown at a particular hospital, but I want you to ignore the name of the hospital and imagine that this story was about your facility where you work, where your friends and family know that you're in charge of reprocessing surgical instruments, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that after the video ends.
UC San Diego's Hillcrest Hospital is opening up tonight about getting in trouble with state health officials over dirty surgical equipment. The problem was serious enough for the state to declare immediate jeopardy. 10 News investigative reporter Jennifer Kastner found out patients were not notified and surgeries kept going.
Immediate jeopardy is what it sounds like. The hospital's errors have caused or are likely to cause serious injury or death to the patient. The issue was in the way the hospital was washing instruments for surgeries. It was a routine hospital compliance check that found alarming problems. Trays had more than half of the surgical instruments with brown staining. Sterilizing machines had large amounts of dark rust color. The exteriors covered with dirt. In a post-operative room, instruments had red stains. A supervisor said if there is still blood on the instruments, someone did not spray as much. Surgical instruments were not cleaned and processed according to nationally recognized infection control standards. The discoveries were made this March and were so troublesome that the California Department of Public Health declared immediate jeopardy at UCSD's Hillcrest Hospital. Officials believed that someone could be harmed or killed. The hospital failed to ensure they had an effective, active, system-wide infection control program. UC San Diego Health sent 10 News a statement Thursday that reads in part, opportunities for improvement were identified within an early phase of instrument cleaning that occurs before the actual sterilization. The hospital chose to reprocess, clean, decontaminate, and sterilize all instruments. There has been no evidence of patient impact or harm. The hospital claims that patients didn't need to be notified and surgeries weren't canceled. 10 News is waiting for state officials to confirm that. Immediate jeopardy was lifted about 24 hours after it began. 10 News has learned that there have been at least 7 other times in years past that the hospital went into immediate jeopardy, according to the state. One case involved a patient who died after staff reportedly failed to notice he had flatlined. The hospital was fined $44,000. UCSD says it's aware that viewers may have concerns about this. The customer service team is available Friday to take your calls and emails. We have that information on our website, 10news.com. In the newsroom, Jennifer Kastner, 10 News.
Important information. Thank you, Jennifer. If there is something you want our investigators to look into, send an email to team10@10news.com.
What a great video to kind of express the true feeling of really what happens on a day-to-day basis out there. And fortunately, I guess I could say, all of us are not caught. But unfortunately, these circumstances do exist, and they do continue on each and every day. We always look at, as sterile processing professionals, the science has proven that sterility assurance levels of 10 to the -6 need to be obtained for surgical items. We know as professionals that's only obtained by cleaning, then disinfecting, and then finally sterilizing items. We have clinical paper or white papers that actually support and justify the importance of following these validated IFUs. We have industry standards and guidelines from AMI, Joint Commission, DNV, CMS, CDC, FDA, AORN, and others that clearly instruct us to follow these guidelines because of the proven science. Unfortunately, when we skip and ignore driven IFU details, thousands are impacted. Deaths do happen. Accreditation loss happens and is experienced. Lawsuits surface. And the reputation of you, our department, the surgeon, and the hospital are impacted. As we move on to the next slide, I don't know if you are aware of it from an industry perspective, but back in 2014 as well as 17, Joint Commission issued safety alerts. And in 2020, they announced new updates and expectations. Although there's been hundreds of articles related to ongoing concerns, in a recent article that was published in Healthcare Purchasing News, it outlines that Joint Commission's future intent. And again, it's really a future intent for our departments to get better. They know about the severe breaches and cleaning of surgical instrumentation. They will be incorporating an enhanced evaluation that takes a deeper dive during the on-site visitations, along with surveyors being trained to the new expectations, as the article had indicated. And this is based upon current professional standards and guidelines. Obviously, DNV will also be working to improve our industry and taking a deeper dive into what we do.
The question that we really have to ask ourselves when we complete our shifts is, do you know, without a shadow of a doubt, that every instrument that passed through your hands was processed exactly the way the manufacturer specified and has been validated in their IFU from the FDA? Unfortunately, the data that we're looking at here from the Joint Commission is most of us would have to answer that question no. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that is. And this is again, not that anyone that is waking up in the morning, going into work and clocking in and saying, I want to hurt somebody today, or I want to ignore the IFU. I don't think anyone in our industry is doing that. So there are contributions to why we're in the situation that we're in, but we've got to be honest with the data and with the stats, and we'll talk about actually some more stats on this next slide, with what the reality is. If we look into some more of the numbers, so you saw the citation rate from the Joint Commission on the last slide, but even here at the bottom, you can see $3.3 billion worth of annual costs associated with surgical site infections, and that comes from CDC data. In addition to that, $41.3 billion of cost that's related to readmission, as you see on the top right. 3 out of 4 immediate threat to life citations from the Joint Commission have been related to improperly sterilized surgical instruments. That is a scary statistic, but it's a statistic, again, that goes into what is happening with IFUs on the front line on a day-to-day basis. And these are the things that the Joint Commission caught. How many days are the Joint Commission on site in your facility compared to how many other days when it's business as usual? Well, these are the things that they caught, but just imagine all of the other potential failures and real failures that happen on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis in our facilities as it relates to following instructions for use. A couple of other statistics you see there on the left, 2,500 hospitals have received readmission penalties. So these are patients who had to come back into the hospital after their procedure for reasons not associated with their initial care. Well, I guess associated, but it's because they had issues and complications with their initial procedure. And that cost is $14,000 plus per hospital readmission across all diagnoses. So huge cost, huge range across the industry. And then targeted even more specific, the ECRI top 10 patient safety concerns for 2020 on a yearly basis. Sterile processing issues make this top 10 patient safety concern list. And again, for 2020, we come in at number 5 for device cleaning, disinfection, and sterilization as a primary patient safety concern in our industry. So this is the reality. Incidents involving in-process, reprocessing instruments do have an impact on the lives of our patients, as Andy mentioned before. There are deaths happening because of breakdowns in IFU compliance.
If I can kind of elaborate a little deeper into this and just looking at the true impact or additional impacts, we talk about SSIs and how severe they are, the cost associated with them. We talk about readmissions, there's lawsuits, reputational damage. You can imagine the trouble recruiting from an employment or a surgeon perspective when they make it to the news. Really, nobody wants to tie their name to those things that make it to the news. We talk about the billions of dollars wasted, and we're talking billions. Unfortunately, it's a staggering number. And when we break it down and look at the national average across the country, is every hospital across this country is averaging roughly 2 to 3% of surgical site infections. And unfortunately, of that, 3% of that population will actually die. And you look at the cost of one true SSI, if it's just an adult or an orthopedic or a pediatric, they can range anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 per incident. So from an industry perspective, we would all want to put our hearts forward and make sure that we are in that direction of making an impact. And if we can prevent just one SSI, let alone 10 and 15 of them, we as sterile processing professionals can actually make that impact and make a difference and positively have these outcomes for the patients.
Yeah, Andy, that's a great point. And looking at the staggering numbers, you could be tempted to say, okay, yeah, that's big, this is a challenge. How do we address it, which we're going to talk about. But if you really drill down to each one of those numbers is a person, and then have that conversation that one death is too many.
Too many,
and,
sure.
And honestly, like $1 is too much, especially when we're talking about all the constraints and all the staffing issues that sterile processing departments have. And then we look at all the costs, all the back-end costs that happen because of breakdowns and surgical site infections. All of that, it adds up, but all that adding up is individuals. These are real lives and real people who have families that we're impacting, not just the data. So that's a good point that you made. Not to be the purpose of sharing that data is to share the overwhelming nature of it, but not to overwhelm you, to keep you focused on a personal aspect of this challenge. As we move on here to the next slide, discussing compliance, I think it's important. We've been throwing out non-compliance, the danger of non-compliance, but before we go too much further, take a moment and define what is compliance in the context of instructions for use. And really, this means doing everything that you should be doing per the manufacturer for every instrument in the exact way every time, not just for part of your inventory, but for all the instruments that we're responsible for. Now, in terms of the required part of compliance, who requires it? Well, there's a lot of folks that come into that conversation. Primarily, it's driven by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and their requirements on manufacturers to supply written cleaning and sterilization instructions for all medical devices based on their classification. So this is a strict national and international standard for medical devices that are coming into the market, and therefore all of those instructions that are provided by manufacturers have to be followed. So that's the primary driver for why compliance is required in sterile processing. But it's not just the FDA. There are a number of other groups from accreditation agencies. So we mentioned the Joint Commission earlier, mentioned the D&D, GL. These folks are coming in assuming, again, that you have these IFUs and that you're following them. In addition to that, you got your state health organizations, Department of Health that come in. CMS sometimes does their own surveys coming in. And again, they're looking for this IFU compliance. We've got other organizations out there such as AMI and AORN that are writing standards and best practices for our industry that are referencing and assuming that you have IFUs for your instruments and that you're following them. So this requirement for compliance is coming from a lot of different directions, all coming in to, again, the shoulders of that frontline technician at the point of processing to have access to the IFUs and to be following them.
Hank, what a great point. I look at just the industry, and I think I'll call it, we lived through it and we're living through it. As you can imagine, what just COVID-19 has just done to our world and our industry. And you think about how much communication came out on the importance of cleaning and disinfecting doorknobs, right? I always look at that as, if we're willing to clean doorknobs, why on earth would we not want to clean and disinfect surgical instruments based upon proven science and validation and the instructions from the OEM? And unfortunately, because of how the industry is currently structured, it unfortunately becomes a little impossible for us to do it the right way. But again, we want to work towards improving what we do for a living. COVID certainly educated the world on this, and we're learning from that.
Yeah, the consumer impact of COVID for even understanding instructions for use of the disinfectants that they're using to clean doorknobs or that they're using to clean surfaces. I know my wife and I had a conversation around the disinfectant wipes. You know, we couldn't find Clorox wipes for a long time there. And so she was asking, well, what else can I use? Well, I showed her the label and said, well, we need to make sure what the label is claiming it kills, and then we need to make sure that we're following the dwell time or the contact time for these wipes. So even folks outside of the medical device reprocessing world have had to come to terms with IFUs and their place in that cleaning and disinfection process. So yeah, that's a great point.
Absolutely.
And so as we transition in here and talk about what's going on with IFUs, we talk about what compliance is, we talk about the requirements and who's requiring them and how we get that pressure to be compliant. But tying in what we started with being honest, what is really going on? If we're honest in our industry with ourselves, with our technicians, with our coworkers, what's going on in our departments on a day-to-day basis? And what is going on is we assume, many of us, when we throw out the word IFU, that we're talking only about sterilization parameters. Are we cooking or sterilizing this device for the appropriate time and temperature? Now, even though that is a critical part of instructions for use, the sterilization parameters, if you look closely at any IFU, there are multiple steps, multiple instructions through the entire workflow. And there's instructions based on particular manufacturer recommendations for cleaning, for disassembly, for inspection, for packaging, all of these things that happen prior to those sterilization parameters. And oftentimes, there's even recommendations and instructions for storage after sterilization. And all of these IFUs have to be followed to be compliant. So because of the scope in our workflow of instructions for use, then that means that there's more opportunities for failures than just at the sterilization step. You know, picking the wrong parameter, the wrong time, the wrong temperature. Those things happen, but just as common, there's all kinds of other breakdowns in the cleaning process. Perhaps we didn't brush long enough. Perhaps we didn't flush properly. Perhaps we're not using the right detergent or disinfectant that's recommended by the manufacturer. That's the reality of our world. And even if you're sitting here today thinking or saying, Hank, I follow all my IFUs every time, I do not compromise, you need to ask yourself, or perhaps ask your coworkers, can that be said of everybody on your team, from the newest employee to the oldest employee, from first shift to third shift? Is everybody coming to the table with the same training, technology, and commitment as you are?
Just to throw some numbers at you, and again, from an industry perspective, and Hank, you mentioned it earlier, we really do want to do what's right. Unfortunately, it's just the way this industry has been created that we're trying to navigate through. Just to kind of give you a little bit of numbers, we know there's maybe 250,000 or even more items or devices, part numbers that come through. We know there's thousands and thousands of IFUs from vendors from around the world. And of course, understanding that validating process, they all use a different validating company. So they have different unique kind of structures that they follow. We know that, as you mentioned, IFUs are completely complex at times. They're very lengthy. I think one of the longest ones I had to read through was about 172 pages. And as you can imagine, as sterile processing individuals, we don't have time for that. We don't have the time to do the needed research. And without proper technology, it's simply, I look at that, unfortunately, it's simply a way of creating an environment that is impossible for us to do it each and every time. So for those that really think you're following all IFUs, I can assure you, you're not. I've only been a part of the industry for about 28 years, and I don't think I recognize or remember 10 IFUs off the top of my head. So knowing that there's thousands and thousands out there, certainly we want to be open and honest about this, and we want to talk about the standard of care. But unfortunately, in sterile processing, we really don't have that true standard of care. We've actually started cleaning and inheriting the idea of one size fits most type of behaviors. One of the next overwhelming challenges that we experience is making sure that, as Hank indicated, every staff member gets the same information. And we look at that. You have staff that have been around in your teams maybe for 20 years. You have new employees that just came on board 30 days ago. Or you're going to look into the future of future employees that are going to come into this department. And you can imagine trying to go back and re-educate every future employee on all IFUs, all manufacturers, and all the complexity to it. And then, again, it's just unfortunately a very difficult position we're put in. From an industry look at, we know that there's turnover in our space. We know we're going to have new staff members. And that creates its own unique position for us as an industry, and trying to figure out how we're going to manage that process. I always look at it, we constantly are climbing a mountain in sterile processing. And unfortunately, without advanced technology to help us, we're never going to make it to the summit. And we have to continue to look for ways that are going to enhance or improve our industry.
Yeah, Andy, you touched on a couple of the reasons why IFU compliance is so difficult, but there's a few more that we'll throw out here.
Yes.
There is no standardized format for IFUs yet. And so even if you like IFUs, you appreciate reading IFUs, you want to find IFUs, if you were to look up IFUs for your instrument, anytime you're going to run into scenarios where the sterilization parameters are not in the same place as they were on a previous IFU, even for the same manufacturer sometimes. And likewise, the cleaning instructions or the storage instructions, all of those things can get mixed around depending on whose IFU it is that you're looking at. And if you think that there is not an issue with interpreting IFUs in our industry, I challenge you during the break in this conference to go onto Facebook and go to one of the sterile processing pages on Facebook and see every single day the questions that are coming in from around the country and around the globe that are asking IFU-related questions based on interpreting what the instructions said or trying to fill in the blanks for IFUs that are just written so poorly that they cannot be interpreted without outside help. This is reality. Folks in the industry know it. The folks on Facebook groups know it. You know it. I'm not telling you anything new, but this is going back to inside our departments, we know these things. Many of us do. Outside, this is one of the purposes for this presentation. There is an assumption that if we just had the IFUs, everything would be okay. Nothing else needs to change. We just need to have access to the IFUs. We're going to talk more about that access myth here later. But as we have highlighted, it's not just a matter of access. It goes all the way back to the beginning of how these IFUs are drafted, how they're interpreted and read by frontline employees and leaders, and even where they're located. We've talked about before on different podcasts and different articles, this idea that IFUs and binders can be accessible if they're in the manager's office that locks at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the manager goes home, and then on second shift, third shift, how do you get access to those written copies of IFU if you're using binders? There's all kinds of one-off examples like that, but that's real life and real challenges that are driving noncompliance. Again, not based on any decision of a person not to follow, but these are systemic issues and challenges that have to be discussed and addressed as we are today.
Yeah, I love the black binder idea. That was my favorite 10, 15 years ago, trying to keep those managed and organized and alphabetized, and staff members would come and open them up, pull the page out, walk to their desk, never replace it. We had outdated items in there. And of course, the next advancement was let's put them on our desktop. And the challenge with that is just keeping up to date with it. We look at the available sources today. We have available PDF files. We have electronic access is what we would call it from an industry perspective. And unfortunately, they give you one PDF file at a time. And as you're aware with our industry, Hank, these trays are not built with one instrument, one manufacturer. Sometimes they have 50, 100, 150 items on these, and they're from multiple vendors at the same time. And the confusion comes into play is how do we actually clean this tray based upon which vendor and what part number and what parameters we're to follow. So, of course, it becomes a very complex, convoluted zone for us to kind of walk through. But having access is just not enough for us to one IFU at a time. We look at the true access and our industry having a problem. Giving us access or us building that binder or putting them on our desktop or going electronically either through a subscription and or Google. It simply is a Band-Aid. It really does not address the true need of following the IFUs, all of them.
Yeah, over these next couple of slides, we're going to start talking about myths. And the first myth, kind of touches on what you were just saying, Andy, because there's a misconception on the part of manufacturers that every sterile process department is created equal. And so when they're writing some of these IFUs, they're writing it with that misconception in mind, and it has an implication then that if your SPD doesn't match what that technical IFU writer thought that it should, then immediately you're confronted with a challenge. Even if you want to implement this IFU again, because of that disconnect between manufacturers and frontline reality in our departments, there's a breakdown. I'll give you a good example of this. A couple of years ago, I called a large orthopedic manufacturer because there was some confusion in their IFU that we had. In their cleaning instructions, it said to sonicate and brush for 5 minutes. So we didn't know, are you supposed to sonicate for 5 minutes and then brush for 5 minutes for a total of 10 minutes? Are you supposed to brush for a little bit and then sonicate for 5 minutes? I called the manufacturer, and the gentleman who actually wrote that IFU was on the phone, and he said, well, you're supposed to put it in the sonic and then brush it for 5 minutes as it's in the sonic. I told the guy, I was like, well, have you been in many sterile process departments recently? Because almost all of our ultrasonic cleaners have a safety process that the lid closes during the beginning of the cycle. So even if you wanted to open the lid and brush as that device is sonicated, it's impossible. That's just one example of many, many examples of that utter disconnect between what reality is in our departments and, again, how these IFUs are being created from the manufacturer's perspective.
Hank, just to throw a number at you, with our data that we're, of course, accessing, we have shown and we're proving that 48%, unfortunately, 48% of the instruments going through our departments right now are not following the manufacturer's validated IFU from a cleaning and disinfection expectation. And what we're recognizing is it doesn't matter what hospital it is. It doesn't matter if you're a university, a surgery center, for-profit, nonprofit, children's. Every one of those types of facilities are actually falling short on following the manufacturer's IFUs. Secondly, it's unfortunately that, as you've indicated, SPD departments are not built equally. I've had the pleasure of getting out and managing maybe over 30 hospitals or facilities and healthcare systems and trying to fix what they have. But as you're aware, many of our sterile processing departments do not have the view of the ocean. They're mostly in the dungeons and they're dark, and they typically don't have the same footprint that is truly needed to actually create production and quality. So there's no windows. Again, like I said, there's no view of the ocean. So we are dealing with departments that are, I call it discombobulated at times and just broken just because of the footprint and what type of space is given to them. I've been into major university hospitals, or I'm sorry, healthcare hospitals that don't even have the proper equipment, unfortunately. And obviously, as you're aware, our industry is short on staffing. Our departments lack financial budgets, and the list goes on of why there are certainly differences out there.
Yeah, another one of the myths that we've already mentioned is this accessibility myth. And this is where technicians feel that if they have access, or if they think they have access to an IFU, that is the same thing as being compliant. And in my job as a sterile processing consultant, when we go on site to facilities, this is one of my favorite questions to ask technicians. I walk up as they're processing a tray in decontam or on the clean side, and I say, can you show me the IFU for that device? And the typical answer is yes. I've got a binder over there that has all of our IFUs. Or yes, we've got an online database, so we access our IFUs. And then they assume that they have answered my question. But my question was not, can you access them, but can you show me the IFU?
Yes.
Then sometimes they will immediately admit defeat and say, well, yeah, actually, I don't know where this particular IFU is, or I forgot my login credentials, and so I don't know how to access the database. And so we get into that honest conversation again that compliance here is not could you access IFUs, but do you have access? Are you accessing, and are you implementing what those IFUs say on an instrument-by-instrument basis in our departments? That's the breakdown for this myth.
Yeah, great points thrown in there, Hank. Just looking at kind of layering or filleting this out a little deeper into what we're doing, just because we have that IFU does not mean that we're following the IFU. Over the past decade as an industry, and you're aware of it, you've run these departments, it really became a checkoff box that we had access to IFUs. And a lot of the times Joint Commission, and if I'm going to go back 10 years ago, they didn't have all the right questions for our department. So they would ask, hey, do you have access to IFUs? We'd say yes. They check the box off and they'd move on. Well, as you can imagine, their questions got deeper and deeper into what we do for a living. As stated, it was really just a checkoff box. As we all know, the instructions by Amy is to access and having access to 100% of them. But we're supposed to also perform ongoing education for 100% of the IFUs for our staff members. Of course, we're supposed to have assurance that we are compliant, or I'm sorry, we have competency for 100% of these IFUs. And we, of course, are supposed to be able to prove that we clean and disinfect and sterilize based on 100% of the IFUs. Even if you have the IFU, it's been proven that most staff members never even access the IFUs. And again, I run these departments and I know how they function. We have witnessed that when an IFU is reviewed, primarily it's because, and I'll speak of me, I'll point the finger and be honest with everybody. The only purpose of us accessing an IFU many times was because either we got in trouble or we had a new item come into the system and we were unfamiliar with it. But what we normally would do from a leadership perspective, our leadership team would access the IFU either through the paper version, PDF version, or one at a time. We would then learn about it from a leadership perspective, but very little or very seldomly would we ever go down the chain of command, and we would seldomly ever communicate to the entire team on what we're supposed to do with that one IFU. So unfortunately, a few people get the information, but the information is then passed along or not passed along. And even if it is passed along, it's diluted and it's not necessarily always accurate. And again, we're trying to be honest here. We want to don't forget about the future employees. Again, every item in your system, and again, let's just assume you have 100,000 part numbers within your system. You're supposed to go back to all future employees and re-educate them on what to do based upon these IFUs. And again, being honest, we all know it's impossible without proper technology.
And that's a great segue, Andy, into the third myth, because we're talking about training in this myth, training and education. And this can be true for new technicians. It can also be true for experienced technicians. But this is the temptation to treat categories of instruments the same, even without drilling down into specific IFUs. I'll give you a great example of it. Let's say that you read the IFU for a particular kerosene rongeur, and you figured out how to clean, disinfect, package, and sterilize this kerosene rongeur. And then you assume that because this instructions follow his process, that you can apply that same cleaning and sterilization process to all the kerosene rongeurs in your facility. If this happens, again, for new technicians and old technicians, and sometimes this gets structured in the training process that we teach people these things. And we say, yeah, for all of our loaner instruments, it's a 5-minute soak, it's a 10 minutes clean, it's a 10-minute sonication, and then into the washer. And that becomes our education program. And that is really setting yourself up for disaster and definitely for non-compliance as it relates to manufacturer-specific IFUs, because they do differ from instrument to instrument, even within the same manufacturer, but definitely across manufacturers. It is not safe to categorize and to pretend that that's a good model for IFU compliance.
Yeah, just excellent points again, Hank. We look at this and I always tell, one size does not fit all or most. And again, we really, from an industry perspective, have created very poor habits. You think about how that would hold up in a defense. If we were to go to infection prevention or risk management or talking to the surgeon, even talking to that patient, or let's get serious enough, and I know that this happens. Let's say we're talking to a jury out there. Would you really feel comfortable saying that you clean everything exactly the same way and you do not follow the IFUs? And we know that's a fact, but unfortunately you could not go to a jury and communicate that and feel good about our performance. We do talk about kind of the poor behaviors, and again, we have to get away from that, the poor habits. And I call it excuses. We have some old concepts that we have to get away from because the industry demands it, the patient demands it. If we look at kind of the next step and kind of that catch-all concept, as you had mentioned, Hank, you're going to hear about categories or families. And again, it's the best attempt to try to do it more accurate. Unfortunately, it's just not the best answer or the best practice. And I'll give you just a quick little sample of what I ran into. I actually did an experiment. I pulled 5 basic hemostats. Everybody has them across the country. I pulled one from Jarrett, one from Novo, one from Asculab, one from V. Mueller, and one from SSI. Every one of those hemostats, again, different manufacturer, validated by different validating companies. Every one of those hemostats had different cleaning and disinfection parameters. So we cannot even assume that general instruments or hemostats are treated equal. We really have to look at every manufacturer, every part number, and every IFU, and then execute the proper cleaning and disinfection practices. Thanks.
So far in this presentation, we have focused on all the risks to patients. And there are many. We talked about all the costs, not only the dollar cost, but the reputation cost to facilities. But I want to add one more topic of risk. And this one is a little bit more nuanced, but it's just as real and it's just as valuable. And it came from an article that I read that interviewed a couple of patients that were notified of a potential exposure through one of the sterile processing breakdowns in the United States. And they interviewed the patient and said, how did it feel to get a call that said, after your recent procedure at our facility, you may have been exposed to HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. And the woman being interviewed said that her life flashed before her eyes and that she began thinking, who is going to take care of my daughter if this is true and if this changes my life? Like, who is going to be able to provide for our family if I have to change the way that I work, if I have to go into treatment for various reasons? And all of this was before any test, any positive test that said that she was actually infected. But that stage from notification until the positive or negative test, so much mental trauma and angst. It is a true repercussion of what we're talking about here. Breakdowns not only impact the bottom line, not only impact patient safety physically, but it also impacts the mental state and fear in our communities for potential exposure. So the risk goes deep, it's complex, it's not just about the dollars, it's not just about lawsuits, as important as those things are. It's also about cultivating and keeping the trust of the patients when they see our name of our hospital on the billboards and they say that's a place that I believe I can go safely, or if not, if they stay away from that because of breakdowns related to following these instructions for processing. This is real life and real patients.
Hank, thanks for just, again, bringing that to surface and what a reality and an emotion that goes into it. On this side, I actually got a chill kind of thinking about the ramifications that actually do happen. And again, these are, many of them are preventable. And if we can actually just come together as an industry to make these impacts, what an emotional difference we can make. That's great.
So these next couple slides, we're going to talk high level about some examples of instruments that cause known challenges in our industry for following and understanding IFUs. So we'll just kick it off here with complex instrumentation. Everybody knows what that photo is on the left there, a flexible endoscope, but really any device that has those moving parts, that has internal cannulas and lumens that have to be cleaned and inspected, these things cause and can cause tremendous cleaning challenges as it pertains to retained bioburden, debris, and biofilm. So anytime you have a complex instrument, your radar should be going off. How do we hardwire IFU compliance in this instrument type and category? In addition to that, ortho instruments, we've all seen these instruments come back to decontam with not only residual bioburden, but gross debris. And it points you back to those sterile processing Facebooks again. If you want to see some photos of examples of the kinds of things that come back on these trays from these orthopedic procedures, it can be startling, especially for new technicians. I still remember the first time that I saw gross debris come back from an orthopedic procedure, and I didn't know what kind of body part that I was looking at. But because of that level of debris, especially in things like shavers and flexible reamers and depth gauges and double action rungers, the complex IFUs that are associated with these are that much more important to have access to and be following on an instrument by instrument basis. It's critical on all instruments, but particularly these orthopedic instruments because of that level of soil with blood and bioburden. Connected to orthopedic instruments, obviously loaner instruments, but we have loaner instruments also for neuro procedures as well as other procedures. But these trays pose a challenge in a different way. These are often the instrumentations that our staff, out of all of the inventory in our departments, these are the ones that they are least familiar with. They're least likely to know the name of the instrument. They're least likely to know how the instruments come apart. They're least likely to have ever looked at the IFU for these instruments, even though, just as with your hospital-owned inventory, the FDA requires these manufacturers to supply instructions for use for these trays. And many of your policies, if you have a loaner policy in place, require in-servicing from these vendors for these trays. So to Andy's point earlier, it's incumbent upon hospital leadership to develop training programs that don't let the new technicians fall through the cracks, but also don't just assume that if it's a loaner instrument, if we don't own it, then a new tray can come into the system and and everyone can just figure it out because it's not going to be here tomorrow. We're just going to use it for this one case. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal because the FDA does not make exceptions for loaned and owned instruments. That same threshold for compliance for instructions for use is still there for loaner instrumentation, just as it is for everything else.
Yeah, Hank, I look at that loaner, I look at the orthopedic, kind of any of this complex stuff, but you look at the reality of a loaner tray coming into our system. And I'm just going to throw out some questions for everybody just to kind of chew on a little bit. It's one of those, here's one of the questions. How often have you received incorrect answers or information from the manufacturer directly? I know I have. How many times have you heard from the local representative dropping the tray off? Just simply process that the same way the other items or everything else is processed. How often do you get trays dropped off without any notice or any IFUs? Yet, as an industry, we're expected to perform that miracle and do everything possible following that IFU for that patient and surgeon. Unfortunately, at this point, it's just not the best environment. We do need a system to help us manage these complex items and situations on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, Andy, I'll add a final category of instrumentation that I know that you've got extensive experience dealing with as well is these laparoscopic instruments and the diverse IFUs that are associated with them, and just the different generations of laparoscopic instruments that we have seen all the way up now to robotic instrumentation. And I can't tell you how many facilities that we go in and consult, and the operating room decided that they're going to add a robot to their repertoire, and no one thought to think, hey, do we have an ultrasonic cleaner in decontam that can actually fit a robotic arm?
Sure.
So the robot was purchased, the procedures have begun, and now we don't even have an ultrasonic that's large enough to fit the arm. Not to mention understanding the time investment and workflow of properly cleaning those devices according to the IFUs. It's really setting up our teams for that systemic non-compliance that we've been talking about for this presentation.
Yeah, Hank, I look at that laparoscopic, and again, I've been out there with all of you. I've been beat up and spit out with the best of them, and you just look at a simple item like a Cleppinger. I've had a hospital force me to go ahead and clean it and then reassemble it and then sterilize it and send it to surgery. And the reason they indicated that is because the OR did not know or understand how to assemble it for the surgeon. So, of course, they wanted just to kind of break the rules a little bit on that. But if you think of that, just that one item, you got to push, pull, twist in order for that device to function properly. And we would look at that as, wouldn't it be nice just to have a technology that delivers a tray-level training video for each individual that I can actually see it being done from decontamination perspective? That will guide us through that. Certainly as a system that gives you a step-by-step instruction would be a benefit for us, I think. Looking at this tray, really the highlights here, I wanted to go ahead and just indicate that if you're looking at just one tray going into surgery, it impacts thousands. And not only impacts the patient, but it also impacts our department. When we have a tray that doesn't meet surgeon expectation, the OR is going to pull a secondary tray, and that just doubles our workload, doubles the stress levels, the emotion, everything that goes into one tray not being processed correctly. So there's a lot of impact that we inflict on ourselves, unfortunately, sometimes, because we just didn't follow the expected IFU details.
If you've been following this presentation thus far and you're convinced, you have gotten honest with yourself or honest with the industry to say, this is a huge challenge. You're right, we don't follow all the IFUs for all of our instruments all the time. But what is the answer? How do we become compliant, and how do we hardwire compliance? What would have to happen in our industry to make this a reality? Over the next couple of slides, we're going to posit a couple of arguments that we think is a critical piece to making this true, easy, and consistent in sterile processing departments, not only in the U.S. again, but across the globe. And the first part of this has come up again and again is the idea of accessibility. We need IFUs to be accessible where the work is being done. This means in decontam, if you encounter a new instrument, that you should be able to access IFU information for that stage in the workflow, No more having to doff all of your PPE, go around to the clean side, try to find the binder, try to remember the product number, and try to remember the information that you find in the IFU. If you find it, go back over to the dirty side, don new PPE, start back in the workflow. That kind of exchange doesn't happen to begin with. Like most folks would not do that. They would make other decisions based on, assumptions and categories, or perhaps, knowledge from training in the past. But in reality, what we need is a technological tool to enable us to access IFUs when and where we need them in the workflow.
I would look at it, what about a system that, actually a guidance system that would look at every part number, every IFU, every detail, and then look at it from a perspective at a tray level, and then calculate, communicate, and document the details for us at the sync level, not just giving you access to one IFU, but actually a calculation looking at all IFUs within that tray, and that would be delivered 24 hours a day. That would certainly eliminate the guesswork within our departments.
And talking about the complexity within trays, Andy, that actually goes in to the next point here about count sheet accuracy and knowing that very few, if any, of our surgical trays are monolithic. So they don't all have the same instrument to begin with, but most of them don't even have all the same manufacturer. So that means our count sheets are inherently complex by design for good reason, nothing wrong with that. But anytime that our count sheets or a recipe list, if you call them that, are inaccurate, that can drive errors in non-compliant steps through this IFU conversation. Because if you don't know what you're really looking at or should be looking at, then whatever you look up that's based on that inaccurate description or product numbers, that could be the wrong information actually for the item that you're trying to process. The same is true for how we're managing any kinds of substitutions in our trays. So let's say, for instance, you can't find a particular scissor that's listed on here, but the operating room has said that you can substitute. However, how are you monitoring and maintaining that that substitute IFU is also being compliantly followed through the workflow, every instrument, every time? And that's one of the challenges that I think has to be addressed with count sheet accuracy.
Yes, that part number is the foundation of that tray. And without that proper information, unfortunately, you just are unable to go ahead and execute and follow the IFUs accordingly.
On this next slide, you already mentioned this, Andy, but documentation is the key in healthcare to proving that something actually happened. And having consulted on a lawsuit with the hospital and dirty instrumentation, I can tell you the first question I asked as a consultant was, show me the documentation. And unfortunately for this facility, the only documentation that they had was they had run a biological indicator test and it passed. So I told the attorney, that doesn't really tell you anything. To tell you that they turned it on in a sterilizer and that it met the time and temperature, but it doesn't tell you if that device was clean when it went in there. If it wasn't clean, as we all know, it doesn't matter what that biological indicator did. It's not telling the whole story. So this goes to, if we really want to get to where we're supposed to go for proving compliance in IFUs and hardwire them, there has to be a documentation aspect in this process that can prove in the court of law or for your accreditation survey that you are actually following and accessing IFUs for all of your inventory every time.
Yeah, being able to prove that we've done what we've done is a big step for us as an industry. You think of a technology that would deliver real-time feedback in a guidance system that would prove in a document that we finally cleaned, we finally disinfected, and then we finally sterilized these trays properly. And being able to provide those reports to senior leadership as well as risk assessment, I think that's a big step forward for us. You look at the documentation also creating supporting structures that would help intervention with staff members, helping them understand what they've done wrong so they can actually get better at what they do as professionals.
And the final piece here comes down to tools. And this is something that we haven't spent a lot of time on in this presentation, but it's a critical part to true IFU compliance. I mentioned it a little bit earlier when I said that IFUs are not constrained to sterilization parameters, and particularly when you're talking about things in the inspection stage, like a visual inspection inside cannulated instruments, for instance, or some type of lighted magnification on the tip of an endoscope, the things that AMI FT91, for instance, says that you should be doing. Well, if it says you should be doing, how are you documenting it, and how is that interfacing with how you're managing compliant IFUs? All of those little nuances that sterile processing folks do on a regular basis. We do the testing, we monitor chemistries, we know that those things have to be accomplished to be compliant. But does our approach to IFUs and the technology around that cultivate a documentation history and provide a structure for inculcating the proper tools for our instrument workflows every time? And I think unless we get to that spot and we wrap in tools and all these secondary tests that we should be doing for instrumentation and safety, I don't think we can get there all the way.
Yeah, Hank, I think excellent points. And I think if we look through the entire presentation today, we talked about a lot of things that would impact our space. We talked about a guidance system that would improve patient care, delivering best practices, driving compliance, a system that would automate workflow to produce consistent outcomes for each current and future employee. What about a system that would accelerate education and long-term training? A system that reduces repairs and replacement expenses? Maybe a system that helps us reduce surgical site infections, legal concern, reducing delays in surgery, increase surgeon satisfaction, an ability to learn from that we can actually learn and execute lean efficiencies, reduce waste, and provide analytic management to help us, from a department perspective, get more items or get more staffing or more trays, that we would have analytics to actually prove that.
Well, Andy, I think as we wrap up this presentation and really leave our audience with a ray of hope, if you will, okay, in all of these challenges, as we've discussed, these are systemic, these are real, and our managers and technicians really have been forced into silence in various, for various reasons and in various ways, from outside and inside pressures. They have been afraid, we have been afraid of speaking up as the culture of the status quo says, everything's okay. Like, we've got IFUs under control. We've been talking about IFUs. How many times can we say the word IFU, right? We've got it together. It's okay. We're making progress. Well, the reality, hopefully you're going to walk away from this presentation saying, we don't have it all together, if we're honest with ourselves. But if we can talk about these problems, the first step to a solution is admitting that we have not arrived, that we don't have it figured out, that we do have a problem. Outside of that, then we can collaborate, internal in our industry and external with the folks outside, accreditation agencies, FDA, manufacturers, collaborate and work together in a way that can truly save the world. And I want to leave just with a short story, if you will, about traveling in our world. And I know we're not traveling a lot nowadays with COVID and everything else, but just imagine for the holidays that are coming up that you travel across town or across state to see your loved ones for the holidays. And, God forbid you end up in a car accident. Well, you're going to go to a hospital, likely that you've never been in. You don't know how the people are trained. You don't know what the process is for IFUs and compliance. And you're going to hope that they are compliant, that they are following all the manufacturer's instructions for use, even though that's a hospital that you have nothing to do with. This story can be duplicated around the country and around the globe in a way that each and every one of us should hope and want and work toward implementing best practices related to IFU compliance in every hospital, because we don't know what hospital we're going to end up in or what hospital our loved ones are going to end up in. So it's not only about keeping our house in order and doing it right in our department, it really is advocating for the globe and moving toward a place with technology that we can ensure best practice every instrument, every time when it comes to instructions for use. So I want to thank you for listening and watching this presentation today. And Andy, I want to thank you for joining me for a great topic.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. We appreciate it and look forward to making a change out there.
All right, everyone. As you can see, the sun is starting to shine here in Minneapolis. Andy and Hank, thank you so much. I'm actually going to invite Andy back onto the webcam. We are over the time, but I do have one quick question for Andy. Andy, do you mind jumping back on really quick?
Absolutely. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes, yes. Right. Wonderful. Andy, we got so many great questions that came through, and unfortunately we don't have it all day to answer them. So I'll send you the full list so you can, email folks directly. But I think one of the questions that's likely on everybody's mind is, what do you do when an IFU is not clear? It doesn't state the time, but it says to use hospital protocol. Do you have any advice for folks with that question?
Yeah, I think, again, the crazy world of IFUs send us in many different directions. And unfortunately, the parameters of how to do things, unfortunately, can be unclear. Some instruments will tell us to do it based upon the cleaning solution. Some will tell us based upon the ultrasonic machine. So again, looking at creating an environment that allows us some standard structure. Some IFUs don't even tell us what to do sometimes, so we're supposed to rely upon the hospital policy. And unfortunately, the hospital policies typically steer it right back to the manufacturer's IFU, which really tell us nothing. So what we do is we actually look at the science and data related to the enzymatic solution companies. and we will come up with what we would consider a hospital default to make sure that things are actually getting cleaned. We know they're all requiring cleaning, but again, to what extent? So we want to be able to steer some proper details back to each instrument if they don't have good information for us to go off.
Okay, wonderful. Well, like I said, so many great questions came through. So Andy, I will get those over to you so you can address those directly. Right. I want to take a minute to thank our conference sponsor, Sterile International. Their dedication to your education is what helped make today's event possible. Just a reminder, there is a 15-minute break between each session. It's down to about 10 minutes now. So if you want to grab a quick cup of coffee, grab a snack, check on the kids, or assemble a tray, whatever you need to do, we will see you all back here in about 10 minutes. And if your screen for the next session does show up with the registration login information, you can certainly click already registered and enter your email. Andy, thank you again for providing such incredible insights on employee safety today related to IFUs. And we'll see everybody in the next session.
Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.